Welcome back. This is Daddy Issues Week, and I told you a little bit about mine. In this podcast, we want you to ask yourself, how did my dad's mental health, brain health impact my life? I think that would be a good question for them to begin to ponder.
Yeah.
And you have some reviews you want to read.
Just one short one. This is by Chen Shang. It's from my YouTube channel. You are touching my soul and spirit. Thank you. So we post the podcast on a few places and they can access it and then pick it up. So
how did your father's mental health, brain health affect your life?
No, this is really interesting. And I think that it's important for us to sort of touch on this because, same dad, but there's me and my two half sisters, and it affected us in extremely different ways. So I think it's because we had different mothers as well. So I think it can be different. But if you talk to my sisters, the impact that my dad and his erratic behavior had on them was significantly worse.
Well, they lived with him.
Right.
And you didn't. You only visited periodically. So dose exposure.
Very true.
So how much exposure you got. So
but I had a
your
very
dad
strong mother
might
too.
be schizophrenic, but if he raised you day in and day out, that left a much more intense, lasting negative imprint, perhaps, than if he wasn't in the picture at all or only periodically. So dose response is really, that really does matter.
So let's talk about some of the issues that the people we deal with and talk to, some of those issues that...
Well, as a psychiatrist for 40 years, this has been one of the major themes in my practice, is not only how'd you get along with your mom, but how'd you get on with your dad?
Mm-hmm.
And
isn't this really important for girls and how they go into relationships with men?
It is, but it's also really important for boys about how they actually feel about themselves.
Okay.
That if you can never please your father, often other people can't please you.
Oh, interesting.
Because you have this pain inside. And we have talked about Eckhart Tolle's concept of the pain body, the sum of all the unresolved hurts you have that can get triggered at a moment's notice without anybody doing anything but looking at you a funny way because they had gas. You can often be triggered for no clear, rational reason because internally you have a lot of unresolved pain.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, when I was a young medical student, someone I loved tried to kill herself. That's why I became a psychiatrist. And, when I sent her to see a really great psychiatrist, we came to find out, and she denied this for a long time, is that she grew up in a severely abusive alcoholic home.
Isn't it weird how you deny things?
She had such shame and felt so disloyal saying that he was an alcoholic, even though the definition of an alcoholic. So if you ever wonder if you're an alcoholic, it's your drinking gets you into trouble and then you do it again. It's like you don't learn that this behavior, in this case alcohol, is potentially toxic to your health, your work, your relationships, or your relationship with the law. And the police had been called multiple times, ended up getting divorced. There was a lot of drama and chaos around the relationship with her father. And so you know what it's like to have addiction around you.
Oh yeah.
And the impact that has
But what my
on
then
children.
it's not true. My dad actually did have issues with substances,
But
but I
you
didn't grow up with
know
him.
in your extended
Right.
family the impact on children. And what happens is deep in your brain, there's a part of the brain called the limbic system. It's your emotional brain. And when you live in an unpredictable environment where there's moments of holy terror, right? Your dad beating your mom, or him beating you, or embarrassing you by the whole neighborhood knows that there's trouble in your house. Even though that may only happen 2% of the time, you never know when it's going to happen. And so it activates your emotional brain. And pretty soon you're always watching
Oh yeah.
for bad things
That I totally get.
to happen. And it changes your brain. And unless you purposefully do something to change it back,
Yeah,
it can always be like that.
Yeah, but some of us don't want to.
Yes, I know you
Because
don't
we
want
don't
to.
trust that it, no, yeah, no. I mean, I don't live in a state of fear, but I live in a state of preparation. So,
But your emotional brain is chronically heightened.
yeah, I'm
in
never
large
going
part
to stop that.
because of the craziness you grew up in.
Yeah, but I also was attacked on the street, and that had nothing to do with it. So there's just this idea
What do you
that
mean
it's
it
not
had nothing
safe.
to do with it? It took your already heightened
No. I mean,
emotional
it had nothing
brain
to do with my parents.
and it made it worse.
Right.
But see, we are a sum of all the things that have happened to us and how we reacted to all the things that happened to us. So getting back to the question, what's the impact, how was your dad's mental health, brain health, and how did that impact you?
I like that. And also, though, what about stepdads?
It's who's the primary male figure in your life. So your biological father was mostly gone, except for, a couple of weeks in the summer. But, your stepdad was very important to you, even though perhaps he didn't get an A for being
He was crazy.
a stepdad.
But he ended up having a huge impact on me. Whether it was good or not is a whole nother question.
So stepdads are very important.
So the question is,
and so I have an adopted child, and his biological father was abusive.
Right.
Was
This is
ADD
what I
from
wanted to
hell.
ask.
Was his mother said she had to chain him, not literally, but to the chair at night so he'd do his homework, and the principal had been called, and was abusive to his wife. And when my adopted son was 9, he shot and killed himself. And given that Anthony, my son, who's now 42, hard to believe, was raised primarily by me,
Right.
he didn't have nearly the same level of trouble
Right.
that his
That was
biological
a big question
father
that I had.
did.
So in my case, I had a stepfather who was a little bit crazy. I mean, although he did have a big impact on my life. But for people whose fathers, maybe you have daddy issues because your dad is either absent, he's an alcoholic, he's abusive. But if you have a stepfather who's actually stable, consistent, and loving, I'm going to guess,
It
can
helps
make a big
to ameliorate
difference.
it.
Right.
And so what are some of the issues that can really cause trouble for a child if the dad has OCD? There's so much time spent around negative thoughts and rituals, that obsessions, compulsions, that it's chronically stressful for
How does
the
it
children.
present that in
That's
the
why
children?
if you have a problem, you want to get it treated so that the stress doesn't roll downhill, if you will.
But how do these things present in people later? If your father was an alcoholic, if your father had OCD, if your father was severely depressed, what ends up happening to people later?
Well, sometimes they develop empathy and become therapists, or psychiatrists or psychologists, sometimes they feel damaged or defective because of what they grew up in, and their self-esteem really takes a negative hit. Sometimes they become superstitious. So if you have an OCD parent, it's like, well, if I do this, then bad things will happen,
So
because
they pick up a little
they
bit of
got
it.
that modeling. There's also, if you have genetic vulnerability, well, you're more likely to struggle with some of those problems unless you get serious about brain health. So yes, depression runs in families, but not always.
What about attachment?
It can significantly affect attachment because your primary attachments were unpredictable. And that may mean when you're in a really good relationship and everything's fine, you may actually unconsciously stir up trouble.
Or just not believe that maybe it's not your template of what is normal. Like when I met you, I kept thinking you were manipulative because I'm like, nobody's that nice.
I am manipulative.
So, well, everybody's manipulative. I meant in a negative way, but it's because if you grew up
I
in
repeat
chaos,
this all the time for my patients, which is we're all out for ourselves.
Right.
It's just the more sophisticated you are, the harder it is to tell. And I am naturally a very nice person.
You
but
are.
I'm really nice to you.
But if you
because
grew
I
up
love
in
you.
chaos, and this is one, so we started off, with a question, and we always end with a challenge, and this is probably going to be one of my challenges. If you grew up in chaos, you may not have a template set for what's normal and healthy and nice, right? Like I didn't. So that wasn't my template for how a relationship or a man is. I mean, my examples growing up were insane. So of what it should be like. So when someone was overly nice to me, see how even I phrased it, it felt like I was waiting for the other shoe to fall.
Always.
And so I actually had to consciously do therapy on that and like fix my picture in my head, which you can do. It's actually not that hard, but you have to be conscious about it.
So if you can
that's my
answer that
challenge.
question, how did your dad's mental health, brain health impact you? And well, what can you do about it? And you just said
Right.
in a very powerful way is you can change your template, and it doesn't just happen
wasn't that
overnight.
hard.
It doesn't
just
happen
takes
overnight,
time.
but it takes focus
Right.
on what do you want? Is this helpful? Is this healthy for you to do?
And it starts with awareness.
So please, link to this podcast, share it with your friends on brainwarriorswaypodcast.com.
And we want to
Leave
hear
a
your
question
comments.
for us. We'd love for you to write a review. We try to answer questions and read the reviews as we can. Stay with us.
If you're enjoying the Brain Warriors Way podcast, please don't forget to subscribe so you'll always know when there's a new episode. And while you're at it, feel free to give us a review or 5-star rating, as that helps others find the podcast.
If you're interested in coming to Amen Clinics, use the code PODCAST10 to get a 10% discount on a full evaluation at amenclinics.com. For more information, give us a call at 855-978-1363.